Well, I think what makes his poetry distinguished is, first of all, his belief that poetry should not communicate ideas, which was an interesting position for me. But what excited me most initially was his incredible sense of the music of the English language and how to employ that music to deepen our sense not only of the possibilities for language, but of the possibilities for imagery. I remember there's one amazing poem about Lake Erie, which seemed almost to inhabit the mind of the lake itself, as though in reading it was like listening to what a lake would be thinking if a lake could be thinking. And that lake would be thinking very musically alongside the rhythms of its own waves. It was a beautiful, beautiful poem. Lakefront, Cleveland. So thunders sea. It gathers strength, summoned, ascends, huged up, then softs. Curls up about rocks, up curls about thick, about bold, curls up about it, then dangerous, soft. Sea gathers strength, summoned, ascends, uphuged over whatever's round, crashes, curls up about rock, up curls about at, boldly, abruptly, curls about it, softs, dangerous, so oft, too soft almost, summoned, ascends, uphuged, crashes, curls up about rock, softs, furious but soft, too soft, whist almost. Womb, whamming everywhere, it gathers strength, summoned, ascends, huged up, splash about of bold, up curls about rock, rocks about impetuous, curls, curls up about, softs, dangerously, too soft with a shudder. That's from his 1976 book, here in the only full-length collection of poetry that Russell Atkins ever had published in his lifetime so far. Sometimes I think of Russell Atkins as an avant-garde movement of one, though, you know, that's also not true. He was the co-editor for many, many years of the only black-edited avant-garde poetics magazine in the country. And in that way, you know, he was really part of a larger movement, too. You know, I think of these boxes that we found in his apartment that are now all sadly destroyed, I suspect, in which my sense of Russell Atkins as this sort of strange solo poet, music theorist living in Cleveland was challenged by finding letters from Langston Hughes and Marion Moore and all of these other major, major poets who were writing around the time that he was writing. They knew who he was, it's just that we don't. Does anyone know who Russell? I think Russell Atkins knows who Russell Atkins is. I think that everybody else has a version of Russell Atkins. His former students who I've talked to or people who knew him, they all have versions of him, and it's fascinating to hear them speak about him. You know, and Russell Atkins himself wrote a little autobiography, not long, I can't remember, 15 pages maybe. It was great to get the Russell Atkins version of Russell Atkins. He paints a good portrait. But no, I don't know. I mean, none of us, we're all just versions of ourselves. I resist the idea that Russell Atkins is entirely this strange hermit poet. He wasn't. I mean, he edited experimental poetics magazine with other people. He communicated with poets in letters and probably in telephone calls. I mean, he was in the world. You can't be a poet and not be in the world. And I understand that there's a temptation to want to see Russell Atkins as a solitary genius, and in some ways he was a solitary genius. Maybe in some ways all geniuses are solitary, but he was also an engaged and engaging person. I do think poetry's caught up to Russell Atkins. In a way, Russell Atkins was writing a sort of poetics that was ahead of its time, and this interiority and experimenting with the movements of music and thought, the sense that poetry can enact the thinking mind, it's something that a lot of younger poets today are very, very interested in. Russell Atkins' diction is unusual.
He makes nouns into verbs, verbs into nouns, adds strange past tenses onto verbs where they wouldn't normally be. It's eccentric, and in some ways it's inventive in the way a writer like Shakespeare is inventive with the language. A writer who's not only trying to make use of the English language, but trying to transform it. But he's like a Shakespeare in Cleveland. He's like a Rust Belt Shakespeare. He also wrote plays, verse dramas, plays that he said were meant to be set to music.
So one of the things that Russell Atkins says about his work is that he composes music like a painter, and he composes poetry like a composer. And that's an interesting thing to say. It helps us to, I think, reimagine what music and poetry do and how they operate, and to try to open some doors on unusual ways and challenging ways of thinking about how these arts work. When you're talking about Russell Atkins' use of white space and use of dashes and stanza structures, I think one way of thinking about how Russell Atkins puts a poem together is that the poem represents on the page the way a mind might be thinking. And the use of white space, or those places where you have a dash in a poem that leave off and a pause, suggest, for instance, moments in which unarticulated thought is being articulated. That is, you have this emptiness, this silence, and that is the poem gathering itself up, and then there's that moment when the thinking is put into words and the poem continues. There's something synesthetic about the way Russell Atkins thinks about music and about poetry, as if we can experience these things not through the senses that we're accustomed to experiencing them with, but with other senses. He believes that we see music primarily, and argues for a visual component to the experience of music. And he also believes similarly about poetry. He refuses to let poetry be something that we hear simply or that we see simply, but suggests that there's a combination of senses going on here. Russell Atkins has a Jeremiad in which he discusses very forcefully how he thinks poetry ought to be experienced. And he says that it is primarily an aesthetic experience, an internal aesthetic experience in which a feeling or a sense or a mode of thought is passed from a writer to a reader. But he resists the idea that poetry is a sort of code that has to be broken, and once we break the code, then we get the idea of the poem and we get the poem's argument. I'm probably putting words into Russell Atkins' mouth here, and maybe the best way to do it is to read his own work, but I would suggest that Russell Atkins would think that writing poetry in a code puts up a barricade between the poet and the reader that shouldn't really be there. At the same time, he also believes that poetry that exists to tell you how to think or to rouse you politically is uninteresting to him, and is probably taking away from poetry some of the ways that poetry can operate most effectively. I would argue that Russell Atkins would resist the idea of interpreting his work. I don't think that's how Russell Atkins operates. I think he believes that his work is primarily something to be experienced and to be thought about and to be listened to and to be seen. But he believes also that poetry doesn't exist to present ideas to us or to argue for things, to make arguments. He believes poetry exists to be experienced. Is that Russell Atkins believed that the process of listening to music and of writing music was primarily psychovisual, by which he meant that we see music in our mind's eye. We see the differences between tones, and we visualize chords, and that is the way of experiencing music. In fact, in this essay, he challenges the notion of music at all and suggests that it might be a pretty meaningless term. I wouldn't be surprised if his sense of music is different from his sense of poetry. That his poetry is musical and his music is dissonant. That wouldn't surprise me. I wonder whether his music sounds as dissonant to him as it does to us. I'm not sure. I can't get into Russell Atkins's mind as much as I would love to.
Russell Atkins' poetry lives in the streets of Cleveland. He writes about Lake Erie. He writes about people he sees walking down the street in Cleveland. He uses the slang of Cleveland, and then he creates his own strange slang-like diction that is unlike anybody else's. But to my ear, it sounds American.
You know, libraries were so important to Russell Atkins. You know, you're talking to him, that came up a lot, was the amount of time he spent in libraries, hanging out in the aisles, reading books. There's something about him looking for somebody who could translate some German for him, because he was really curious about what this German music theorist was saying. I mean, Russell Atkins was an autodidact. Yeah, he was. He still is. I mean, I expect. He loved to read and to think about big ideas and to argue big ideas with other musicians and music theorists and students. And yeah, and I love that much of the rediscovery of Russell Atkins is taking place in libraries. That seems really, really nice. It seems appropriate. Yeah, I love that the Sounds of Cleveland are interfering with us talking about Russell Atkins, because I think of Russell Atkins as, you know, somebody who's part of the Sounds of Cleveland also. So here's another poem where you can see, I think, Russell Atkins interacting with real immediacy and directness with the sounds of Cleveland, or, you know, with the sounds of an urban environment. It's a beautiful poem. It's one in which there isn't, you know, a lot of complicated, I think, thinking happening. There's more kind of complicated listening, which is something that Atkins does really well. It's called Train Yard at Night. Thunder, thunder, the huge, bold blasts black. Hiss insists upon hissing, insists on insisting on hissing. Hiss, hiss, when whoosh, the sharp scrap making its fourth lap with a lot of rattle trap and slap, rap and crap. I listen in time to hear coming on the great limited, its rolls, scrolls of fold, like one traditionally old, coldly. Meanwhile, hiss, 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 insists upon hissing, insists on insisting on hissing, hiss, hiss, That's from his 1968 book, Heretofore, though the version of the poem I saw was dated 1953 and then dramatically revised in 1961, and then revised again dramatically in 1963. So that gives you a sense of Russell Atkins's process, too, that he's always going back and repainting his work. I'm afraid with all this talk about Russell Atkins, we're making him sound humorless, like a pure intellectual or a pure musician, but he's also got a very quirky and very funny, witty way of looking at the world.
Russell, do you want this typewriter?
Yes, why not?
What are you going to do with it?
Well, I'm going to let it sit a while and help give the impression that I'll write again, which I'm not sure of.
Okay, everybody, say goodbye.
Okay.
Bye. Bye, Russell. Goodbye. It's so great to see you.